Hey everybody. So we are actually going to start chapter 17 today, which is titled Darwin's Theory of Evolution. And chapter 17 kind of brings us into the first part of this unit that's going to be about natural selection and what we call biological change, so change in species over time. What we're looking at here on this picture is actually something that he created in one of his many, many notebooks. And if you're not sure of who he is, who I'm referring to, it's a man by the name of Charles Darwin. If you've never heard of Charles Darwin, that's going to be kind of where we start here in chapter 17 with section 17.1. We're going to look at kind of his background and his work and his research and how that led us into our current understanding of what evolution is. All right. So for our section title here, section 17.1, make sure you write that down. And then also the heading there, A Voyage of Discovery. So to start us off with this section, a few things. This work that we're going to be talking about was done more than a century ago. So Charles Darwin did his work around, I think it's the 1860s, if I'm not mistaken. We may see that date here in a minute. But later in the 19th century, right? So we're looking at now 150 years or even beyond that in the time that has passed since Darwin kind of discovered these things. And his work has been very influential in terms of understanding where species come from and how they change over time in terms of their ability to survive. So again, our objectives, we're going to look at Charles Darwin, who he was, what he contributed to our knowledge and understanding of species. And then we're going to look at 3 patterns of biodiversity. And actually, I think that one's something that we're going to come up with here in a little while later. So when we look at Charles Darwin, here he is. He was British. He was born and raised in England. He was the son of a minister. And what's odd about Charles Darwin is that oftentimes when we talk about evolution, there's like this conflict between religious interests and then those of the scientific community. But Charles Darwin had no preconceived notions, I guess I should say, about how this may contradict or conflict with religious beliefs. And part of that reason is because of how he was raised. He was a very religious man and died a very religious man. His work did not interfere with what he knew to or believed to be true in terms of his faith. So one of those things to kind of keep in mind, his research we're about to talk about is not something that is difficult to comprehend or it doesn't cause a lot of ethical kind of questioning, okay? So Charles Darwin was, again, around in the 1800s, the 1809 to 1882. You do not need to know those dates. But what you should know is that as part of his research, he became one of the most influential scientists of his time. He's still widely regarded as what we call the father of evolution because of his work that was done in the 1800s. He kind of initiated his work on a worldwide voyage. Okay, so we're talking 1800s. We're talking about a ship to get from one part of the world to the other, and he traveled on this ship called the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836. So it took them 5 years to get all the way around the world, and he visited places like South America, and he traveled through the Indian Ocean and went to Africa and then traveled back up to England and Europe. And as part of that travel, what he did is he would record and look at different species found in different locations. He took lots of different samples of things. And in so doing, he was able to kind of refine and develop this theory of what we call biological evolution. So evolution here on the right, you can see we've got a definition. Evolution, as we identify it, is defined as a change in a species over time. And based on his research, based on his findings from this series of places he visited in his travels, he created and wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. And this is also a pretty famous book. Very lengthy, very wordy, but he proposed in this book basically how modern organisms may have descended from ancestors in the past, so how traits perhaps have changed over time. Okay, So, as I mentioned, what he did on this voyage, this 5 years voyage, he filled notebooks with observations. He collected specimens, including fossils from different places. And he was fascinated by the biodiversity of a variety of the ecosystems he observed and visited, the most important of which, at least in terms of our knowledge of evolution, it would be the Galapagos Islands, which are way over here. All right, so this is kind of showing you the trek and the pathway that the Beagle took. So they left England here, traveled down around the tip of South America, up and next to the Galapagos Islands, and then over here towards the Pacific and Indian Ocean, around Australia, Africa, and then back. All right. So some of the things that he studied on the Galapagos Islands, importantly, were finches and tortoises. And we're going to talk about those here in a second. But again, he was looking at traits, right? And so he didn't develop this theory of evolution while he was on the Beagle. I mean, that's something that takes many, many years. He developed and refined his theory based on the specimens that he collected and the analysis of those after he returned to England. So one of the things that he noticed when looking at these different specimens was the similarities and the differences that he noted between different groups of organisms or different species. And I'm referring to those similarities and differences either among species that live in close proximity, but also among species that live in very distant places. All right, so we can talk about, in regards to this, species that exhibit a lot of variation between two different groups, and then the variation that occurs among individuals within the same group. All right, so these terms that you see here towards the bottom, interspecific variation, this refers to the differences among individuals in different species, if that makes sense. All right, so you can see we have two different species of birds right here. We've got an ostrich and I'm maybe an emu here, something that's a little bit smaller. And you can see they share some similar qualities, some similar characteristics, but obviously there is some variation, right? The bird here on top is larger. It also has darker feathers and darker coloration. The bird down here looks like it's more camouflaged its environment. It's certainly lighter, more grayish in color. This neck appears to be straighter. This one is more bent and curved. The beak shape and the head size appear to be slightly different. The leg length would be different. So even though these things appear to be similar, there must be, according to Darwin, there must be specific reasons why they differ in terms of some of these traits. So for whatever reason, it's beneficial for an ostrich to have this darker feather. And it's also beneficial for this bird down here to have this grayish coloration pattern. Okay, so the differences between these two are what we call interspecific variation. So if we consider just the feathers, the feather color differences represent a type of interspecific variation because these are two separate species. Now, in contrast to that, we could think about also the variation that occurs among individuals of the same species, and that is very similar to what we can talk about with humans even, right? Having brown hair or blonde hair or red hair or curly hair or straight hair. There are lots of different traits that we can all have for specific factors that make us up, right? We talk about eye color, blood type, skin color, height. All of those things have a variety of appearance traits that you can actually obtain and have based on what mom and dad passed down to you in their genes. And that is what we call intraspecific variation. If you were sitting in my classroom right now, I would be calling out specific people and pointing out specific differences between individuals sitting in the classroom as representing intraspecific variation. Okay, so that is again among the same species. Inter is among different species. So in talking about these different forms of variation, one of the things that he paid attention to, as I mentioned, were things like tortoises on the Galapagos Islands. So Galapagos Islands, a lot of times as these ships were kind of passing through, they would kind of pick up these tortoises and take them on board the ships and use them for food on their long journeys, especially on the Beagle, where they had to go essentially from the Galapagos Islands all the way to Australia. That would have been a long, long trip without a whole lot of food for the crew. So the tortoises that he obtained, those specimens, were probably also consumed on the ship, or at least had been consumed on the island prior to venturing out for that last leg of their journey. But in looking at these tortoises, these are two different species of tortoises found on the Galapagos Islands. And so based on that, just looking at the qualities here, you can see they have some significant differences, right? This one here has a more dome-like shell. It's got a shorter neck. It sits lower to the ground, and its legs here appear also to be a little bit shorter. This guy here on the left has a much longer neck. Notice how it's kind of standing up on top of these front legs. And notice the shell isn't quite as curved and dome-like, right? It's a little bit more kind of flat. And so when we think about these differences, obviously these are two separate species. So again, we call this interspecific variation. Now, what he noticed about these was based on the accounts that he had taken, based on the information he had written down in all of his journals and notebooks. He noticed that these traits seemed to be perfectly suited to the environments in which these species lived. So, in other words, this guy here must be having to consume plant life that sits a little bit higher up off the ground, right? It's not going to be eating all the grass here at the bottom. It's going to have to reach for something in a bush or maybe a low-lying tree, something to provide food for it, okay? This guy, on the other hand, is not going to be able to reach up and try and obtain food, right? This one on the right is going to have to resort to eating the stuff that's on the ground, right? So the environments in many ways kind of drive the selection of these types of traits. So in other words, determine which ones become more common in a population and which one kind of becomes the ultimate features for each specific group. Okay, so traits that he's paying attention to within tortoises and finches appear to be suited and specific to each island's ecosystem, biogeography, and climate. So meaning maybe it's very hot and dry, right? That would be our climate piece here. Maybe it's very rainy and it's like a rainforest, right? Lots of sunlight, lots of plant life, but also very rainy. That's a totally different type of climate. Biogeography, by the way, references and refers to landforms. Okay, so if it's mountainous, if it's desert-like, if there are lots of rivers that flow through it, right? If there are valleys, all of that ties into this. And so it didn't seem to matter to him, which type of species he was looking at. It seemed that they were all well suited and fit for their environments. So this is an example of an armadillo and what we think is an ancient kind of ancestor of armadillos. You can see over time how this species has changed. We've gone from a very, very large animal, 3 meters in length here, to an armadillo, which is just half a meter in length. And probably the reason for that is just the development of other species around it and its community, and also how it's changed over time in terms of fitting into its specific ecosystem, right, and what it's consuming. So an armadillo doesn't consume lots of large things. They consume insects and other smaller types of organisms like that. So there's no real need for it to be this large, but a half a meter is kind of fits better into the community in which it's going to survive, okay? In addition to this, all right, a couple of other things that we can add to Darwin's work here. Like I said, he recorded lots of observations. He took home specimens with him to England. And when he got back to England, one of the things he noticed is that there are a lot of island-specific birds, essentially. Finches here, like we're looking in this image. These are all 4 different types of finches. And he noticed that they kind of resembled the species that he was seeing outside of his window in England. All right, so there are lots of species that share some similar characteristics kind of across the world, and chances are these things have, a distant common ancestor from a long, long time ago that they can kind of thank for those similar features. He also noticed that in comparison of other types of landforms, right, if you compare what was on the islands compared to the South American mainland, he saw some similarities there, but again, some very distinct and unique differences based on the place in which these organisms were found. So when we think about the Galapagos Islands, one of the things I have not mentioned is that there are a whole bunch of them and that they are pretty diverse. So meaning there are like 20-ish of these islands. I can't remember the exact number. They're volcanic islands, so they form, as kind of the crust moves over this spot, deep, deep underwater. And some of these volcanic islands are kind of like Hawaii in that they're well forested and they get lots of rainfall and they're very tropical because they're near the equator. But then there are others that are more mountainous and more desert-like with not much plant life, not much rainfall. and kind of fit that bill. So in thinking about the diversity of the islands, one of the things he was able to pick out is the diversity of the species and how that then relates to where these different groups are found. So given all of that information, what that's pointing to for Darwin is that animals, it appeared, were able to adapt to their surroundings. So meaning they could change over time in a way that became beneficial for survival. So for example, the tortoise that's able to kind of like stand up, right? That tortoise is able to survive in its environment if plants are growing up higher because it's actually able to reach, right? Those tortoises that don't have the ability to reach all the way up likely don't survive long enough to actually be able to reproduce. And the same is true for the other tortoise, right? So the traits that allowed for the best survival are the ones that tended to kind of be become more common in a population. All right. So at the end here, we've got adaptation. Adaptations, by definition, these are features that allow organisms to better survive in their environment. Adaptations can be lots of different things. For the tortoises, it could be the leg length and the neck length and the shape of the shell. Here with these finches, usually we talk about beak size and beak shape as an adaptation that's necessary for survival. Okay, and we'll talk in the remaining part of this chapter about adaptations. You're going to hear me say that a whole lot more and how those become important. All right, but that was something that was kind of created and a term that was first used by, again, Charles Darwin. Okay, that's all I have for 17.1. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I will see you later. Bye, all.